Hello and welcome to my channel, Rhino here. Today I've decided to take a peek at what Answers News is doing lately because they are always just so very wrong about almost everything they say, and I guess I'm just a masochist or something, so here we are. At least they make more sense than the brick architect judge guy, though that's not really saying much, is it? Let's go!
So our first article is always a bit of a funny one, all right, because you got to be not too serious here. So Noah criticized for lack of social distancing on the Ark.
Yeah, that's a Babylon Bee article. If you are not familiar, the Babylon Bee is kind of like an unfunny Christian version of The Onion, where they write what is supposed to be satire, but usually ends up coming across as being essentially the same as the jokes that kids who are too young to actually understand how humor is structured would tell. I'm skipping most of this segment, but I wanted to touch on this bit at the end.
But can you imagine, Noah? I mean, trying to get the permits for all the animals?
Yeah.
Can you imagine that?
Yeah, that would be definitely hard.
They wouldn't be allowed to because we can't even get permits for certain animals in the Ararat Ridge Zoo.
I know.
Right? Heaven forbid we behave responsibly when it comes to making sure not only that you have the proper facilities to adequately care for these animals, but also that we are minimizing the risk to the local environment should any of the animals get loose. Leave it to Ken Ham to turn reasonable restrictions on who can own which animals into a Christian persecution narrative.
Hey, I tell you what I thought of when I looked at this. The people who did not repent and who were judged at the flood, they'll be social distance forever.
Ha ha ha! People who don't believe like me will burn in hell forever! Isn't that a funny joke?
Twitter blocks focus on the family. So this is yet another example of how Christians and Christian organizations are being deplatformed on social media.
Yes, Twitter banned one of the official Focus on the Family accounts. This has been such a major deplatforming that the CEO of Focus on the Family appeared on the Christian Broadcasting Network to talk about it to their international audience. He's written about it on his publicly available Focus on the Family blog. He's talked about it on his podcast.
And more recently, our news outlet, The Daily Citizen, was censored on Twitter.
And would you believe it, they even offered to lift the ban if the account that tweeted the content that violated the Twitter rules would agree to delete the tweet, which I assume they eventually did, going by the fact that the account in question is back up and running on Twitter as of now. And the primary Focus on the Family Twitter account was never blocked or banned, it was just this affiliated account. All of this blatant censorship really hurts. Now go on, tell me how they were oppressed simply for being Christian.
And so what Focus on the Family had done was an article that really questioned Dr. Levine and Rachel Levine, who is a transgendered, we were saying, how do you say this? So she is actually a he, okay?
Georgia, this is simple. When someone is trans, they are just whatever gender they are transitioning into. She is actually a she, but her biological sex didn't end up matching with her gender. It really is that simple. Now, sure, if you want to get into the nitty-gritty details and some of the science about how and why this happens, it can get pretty complicated, but the social aspect is really easy. If someone tells you they are a woman and prefer the accompanying female pronouns, then you address her as a woman with those pronouns. Easy peasy. And for anyone doubting the reality of transgender identity, I'd recommend reading through the website that I've linked in the description. It goes through some of the history of the science behind how we learn about what exactly it is to be transgender, what are the causes, and how we know it's a real phenomenon. Twin studies indicate that there is a genetic component. Identical twins are much more likely to both be trans than fraternal twins. Brain scans indicate that in trans people, their brains line up better with the gender that they identify with than with their biological sex, even before any hormone treatment begins, and even when compared to brains of cisgender individuals who are on some of the same hormones but for different reasons. Being trans is literally having a brain whose gender doesn't match the physical sex of the body. As humans, our brains and bodies are both sexually dimorphic, and when these dimorphisms don't match up in the same individual, you get a trans individual. There is more to it than that, and I can already hear people objecting along the lines of chromosomes or gametes, as though those arguments actually make any sense, but that's a good place to start.
But he transgendered, and so they were questioning the qualifications of this person to be, I believe it's Assistant Secretary of Health.
And when talking about the qualifications for the Assistant Secretary of Health, Did they bring up her history in studying pediatrics, or her role as Pennsylvania's physician general, or her success in implementing life-saving measures like allowing police officers to carry anti-overdose medications, or her history in setting up a clinic for treatment and prevention of eating disorders among youth? No. The tweet said, Dr. Levine is a transgender woman, that is, a man who believes he is a woman. It was not any legitimate criticism of her qualifications. It was an insult based on the fact that she is trans. Such behavior is unambiguously against the Twitter terms of service, so Twitter temporarily suspended the account. It has nothing to do with being conservative or Christian. It has to do with clearly violating a company's policies.
And so what they were doing was just questioning his qualifications, not questioning the fact that he had transgendered to a woman, and yet they get removed.
What part of the statement, Dr. Levine is a transgender woman, that is, a man who believes he is a woman, is questioning qualifications and not the fact that she is trans?
Yeah, now we even have deplatforming by churches.
Yeah.
Because one of our speakers recently was at a church in Arkansas, and after speaking, similar talks to what I would give first up in a church on, all the doctrines founded in Genesis, and marriage is founded in Genesis, and marriage is one man for one woman, and so on. And anyway, the pastor did not like him talking about that, and they deplatformed him, removed his videos and that from their Facebook and church, and asked him not to speak on that particular topic. So,
Okay, Ken, since you are so obviously against deplatforming, can I assume that you'll let me come down to the Creation Museum and give a talk on your stage to your audience about the science of evolution? Not a debate like you did with Bill Nye, just me presenting the facts of evolution. If your answer is no, then you are engaging in worse deplatforming than your speaker experienced in that Arkansas church, because at least he got to go give his talk and finish it. He's just not allowed back and doesn't have his videos on that church's website or YouTube channel. I understand that I do not have a right to your platform. If you can understand why it's okay for you to choose not to host me as a speaker, then you should also be able to understand why it is okay for a church to choose not to host one of your speakers.
But who would have ever thought we'd see such censorship in America?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like living in a communist country.
So much censorship in America, he says on his uncensored, freely available international broadcast from his museum dedicated to presenting his worldview unopposed, while sitting in front of a picture of his other museum dedicated to the same thing. And let's not forget the fact that the government subsidizes these escapades by exempting AiG from most taxes, and on the rare occasion when they might be stuck with a tax, AiG engages in shenanigans to try and avoid it, to the extent where the word Arkonomics has been coined to describe their shenanigans. They are not censored, and they are subsidized, is what I'm getting at. Now, I'm skipping most of the next story. They're talking about trans women in sports, and this is a subject that I mostly avoid because I just don't care about sports, and I can't bring myself to care about them, and I don't want my apathy about sports to come across as apathy toward the people in sports. But I just want to play these two brief clips, one after the other for you.
The women just can't compete.
It's going to totally destroy women's sports, isn't it?
Well, yeah, there's no such thing as women's sports really anymore.
And there's a lot of girls that are saying they're not going to get scholarships now to be able to go to certain universities and so on because these guys are going to be beating them in sports.
Yeah.
And the guys are saying they're girls.
I honestly think all women should just walk out of women's sports. They should just leave it because then there's not enough transgender people, I don't think, to have these sports continue.
So which is it? Are there so many trans athletes that women's sports is going to be completely swamped with them and it'll ruin it for everyone? Or are there not nearly enough trans athletes to actually carry on the sport unless the cis athletes are there too? It can't be both.
Purported phosphine on Venus more likely to be ordinary sulfur dioxide.
As of the writing of the script, I have not yet watched through this particular segment, but this is the one that made me want to respond to this video. So I'm just going to make a quick prediction before we jump in. They are going to suggest that the original paper, which suggested that life is one of 3 potential sources for phosphine in Venus' atmosphere, was so hell-bent on finding proof of evolution that they were eager to see something that wasn't there, and so misread their data as being phosphine, but now we've learned that it is actually sulfur dioxide, a gas that is common on Venus and absorbs the same wavelength of light as phosphine. And I predict that they will present this as though the original scientists were well aware of the fact that sulfur dioxide absorbs the same wavelengths of light as phosphine, but decided to call it phosphine out of their desperation to find signs of life rather than because it's where the data pointed.
All right, so we reported on this several months ago when it was making these big headlines about the fact that they had found phosphine on Venus, because supposedly that I use that term, may be a sign of life. They think here on Earth, that's a sign of life.
The only known chemical processes that can result in phosphine are biological processes. As far as we know, phosphine does not occur without biological assistance. This does not mean that there is no abiotic process that could potentially result in phosphine, just that we don't know of any. That's why the headlines were saying what they did. And yes, I would agree that the headlines mostly oversold the findings. This is actually a major problem in science reporting today.
But then they did a lot more studies and they found out it's just plain old sulfur dioxide.
Yes, but here's the kicker. Do you know how they made that determination? It wasn't through direct observation. That's where the phosphine conclusion came from. It was from, wait for it, climate modeling. When they modeled the climate and atmosphere of Venus and applied it to that data, it was found that the clouds of phosphine that were observed were actually much higher up in the atmosphere than originally thought. At such a height, phosphine molecules would be incredibly fragile, to the point where the amount that was observed would require new phosphine to be pumped into the lower atmosphere of Venus at a rate equivalent of 100 times that of the rate that oxygen is pumped into Earth's atmosphere by photosynthesis. What happened that made the original researchers conclude that it was phosphine instead of sulfur dioxide is that they failed to account for the somewhat counterintuitive effect that gases that are nearly ubiquitous in the atmosphere give off a weaker signal than gases that are found in smaller amounts, known as spectral line dilution. And actually, that's not quite fair. They did account for spectral line dilution, but they made their determination that it was phosphine based on 2 observations. And for one of the observations, the spectral line dilution would not have had as great an effect according to the climate modeling, and so it produced an artificially strong signal, which the original researchers interpreted as an artificially weak signal in the other observation. Which, again, to be fair to the original researchers, was the appropriate interpretation based on the data that they had at the time. So, you know how I like to mention in some of my other videos that the line between observational and historical science is a blurry one? This is a good example of that, though to be fair, climate modeling doesn't really fit into historical or observational, so I wonder what category Ken would consider it to be. But the direct observational data pointed to one conclusion, but that conclusion turned out to be the wrong one once you consider additional modeling data alongside it. But I particularly enjoyed this because AiG typically dismisses concerns about climate change because climate modeling is, in their view, not a very well-developed science that leaves a lot to guesswork. And yet, here they are, smugly dismissing the original paper which was based on direct observation with nothing but new modeling data.
It's only a model. Shh.
Now, I'm not saying that the new data are wrong. In fact, I'm inclined to agree that finding a gas that is known to be commonplace on Venus is much more plausible than finding a gas that is only known to be produced by life. It's just a good example of how AiG likes to cherry-pick the science, only accepting that which fits into their twisted view of reality.
This got headlines. It was even mentioned on the
I haven't seen
TV
this in a
news
major
and so on.
headline.
Phosphine found on Venus. There could be life on Venus and so on. Now they've done this research and said, no, we don't even know that means that's because of life anyway.
Right.
As much as it pains me to, I agree with these guys at Answers in Genesis. Excuse me while I go throw up a minute. The headlines should not have made as big a deal out of it as they did, and since they did make such noise about it, the responsible thing to do would be to make at least as much noise about pointing out that the initial paper appears to have been mistaken. But unfortunately, corrections don't generate clicks.
Well, they're just trying to, but it is a good example of how good observational science works, right?
Actually, this is a good example of how the distinction between observational science and historical science is not a valid distinction. The original headlines were based on a paper that is much closer to direct observation than the subsequent correction, and yet you guys prefer the correction to the original paper, despite the fact that it is based entirely on modeling and simulation.
Scientists should be checking one another to make sure that their claims are valid, and so it's good that it was checked. And
yes, scientists should do that. And they do, regularly. Stories like this wouldn't exist if they didn't. And that's the end of that story. Surprisingly, they didn't accuse the original researchers of imposing their evolutionary biases on the data, and despite the fact that none of them seemed to have read the article they were displaying to find out that it was based on simulations modeling rather than direct observation, they were still mostly correct throughout that segment. Broken clocks and all that, I guess my prediction was wrong.
Would they do this for people who are preaching atheism? or preaching secular humanism.
I'm skipping most of the segment because it's them disagreeing with a Danish law that I also disagree with, though admittedly our reasons for disagreement are very different, but it does always kind of bother me when I end up agreeing with them regardless of the reasons. But I did want to address this point brought up by Bodhi. You see, this law, as they pointed out in a spot that I skipped earlier, is directed specifically at Muslims who might be preaching radicalizing messages in Arabic, but they can't just make a law that only affects one religion to the exclusion of all others, because that is just blatant discrimination. So they just made it a blanket law for all religions. And I say made it a law, but it was just a proposed legislation. I can't find anything about it having actually passed. Though to be fair, the search engines are a bit clogged with indignant Christians complaining that censoring Christian sermons is just an attempt to be politically correct, thereby implying that censoring Muslim sermons is okay as long as they leave the Christians alone. So it's hard to find information on it without wading through this sort of thing first. All this to say that, yes, if there are atheist and or secular humanist services going on with sermons, the same rule would apply equally to them.
Or sexual humanism.
Sexual humanism! Yes!
What the fuck was that?
One of the things we've been saying over and over again with certain laws that get passed, they're unlocking a door.
Right.
And they unlock a door that's dangerous because then that door gets pushed open for the future. It's like with conversion therapy laws in regard to LGBTQ and so on. When you look at what, like in Australia just recently, the law actually outlaws you praying with somebody or even teaching that homosexuality is a sin.
Okay, this is where my agreement with them just completely up and vanishes. Firstly, I'm not entirely sure what Australian law they're talking about that makes it illegal to say homosexuality is a sin. I can't find any such law. What I did find was that in 2019, Australia repealed a law that banned the promotion of homosexuality, a law which had such consequences as not allowing teachers to stop kids from bullying based on sexual orientation. The repealing of this law is a good thing. But I can't find anything about prayer now being illegal, or saying that homosexuality is a sin is now illegal. It's illegal for schools to teach that it's a sin, sure, but I think that hateful preachers such as yourself are still free to declare it as such in a non-educational setting. And yes, conversion therapy should absolutely be illegal. It is a practice that directly and demonstrably results in suicide and mental health issues.
Okay, more evidence that Neanderthals were absorbed by humans, not wiped out. So this is based on some teeth that they've actually had for quite some time, but they're finally getting around to really kind of looking at them and understanding them. And they're like, these teeth have characteristics of both Neanderthals and humans.
I thought Neanderthals were humans.
They are.
Yes, Neanderthals are a subspecies of the genus Homo. All subspecies of this genus are classified as humans. This does create some confusion, as most articles aimed at laypeople will colloquially use human to refer to modern Homo sapiens sapiens, and will use words like Neanderthal or Denisovan to refer to the other various human subspecies.
So they found that humans have human teeth?
Pretty much, yeah.
No, not pretty much. Do any of these guys actually read past the headlines? These teeth were found more than 100 years ago, 13 teeth in one location. They had been assumed to belong to a single individual. Recently, though, they were re-examined with modern methods, and it was determined that one of them belonged to a non-human animal, and also one was lost along the way, so that leaves us with 11 human teeth. It was further determined that these teeth belong to 2 individuals, and they both show signs of hybridization of traits, demonstrating traits that belong to Neanderthals and traits that belong to modern humans in the same individual. We already know that Neanderthals interbred with modern humans, but what is unknown is the exact extent of this interbreeding, and finding fossils of hybrid individuals indicates that it may have been rather commonplace. So no, we didn't just find humans have human teeth, we found evidence that human Neanderthal interbreeding may have been a relatively common occurrence.
We always say this with Neanderthal articles because they act like it's such a big deal, you know, but that humans and Neanderthals interbred, but it's really just humans breeding with humans, you know.
I'm actually curious about the details of how AiG thinks about Neanderthals. You can see on their page about them that they consider them to be descended from Adam and Eve, but the problem is that through genetic analysis it has become apparent that they most definitely are a separate species from us. I mean, it was apparent before, but back then creationists could appeal to the fact that individuals vary, so maybe Neanderthals are just humans with a nasty case of arthritis. We knew they weren't, even then, but that didn't stop the creationists from making that claim. But now that we have sequenced the Neanderthal genome and have recognized the presence of up to 4% distinctly Neanderthal DNA in many modern human populations, it is impossible to deny that Neanderthals existed as a distinct species, and yet somehow both they and modern humans are direct, fully human descendants of Adam and Eve. And this gets even more complicated when you add Denisovans into the mix, because now there are 3 definitely distinct species, all human, that need to be descended from this one human couple, and had time to differentiate into 3 distinct species with only a couple percentage genetic crossover in just a few thousand years, and also AiG puts Neanderthals and Denisovans as being post-flood. In other words, one of the lines of Noah's children became Neanderthals, another became Denisovans, and a third became modern humans, and in just 4,000 years they had time to not only become genetically distinct from each other, but then to interbreed, and then 2 or 3 of them die off. And what would this mean for Noah and Adam? What kind of humans would they have been? This view firmly places Noah as the evolutionary common ancestor for humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans, and I just find this fascinating, but they don't go into any detail about it. And that's all of this episode that I want to cover. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Chris Snyder, who says, "Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Even that verse is demonstrably incorrect." Well, I would agree that this verse is, in fact, demonstrably incorrect. The defense will undoubtedly be something along the lines of, well, humans aren't perfect, so clearly the parent didn't do a good enough job raising the child in the way he should go, and that's why he departed from the way when he was old. Thanks for watching. Special thanks as always to my patrons, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, What Jesus, and all the rest, who are the Denisovans, who are a distinct species from the Neanderthal that is my channel. If you'd like to be fully human and yet not a modern human, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist, which are linked in the description. If you'd like to listen to my videos in podcast form, the link for that is also in the description, as well as links to my social media accounts and my P.O. Box address. See you next time!